I'm Elena Rodriguez, 29 years old, and I never imagined that a routine family dinner at our ancestral mansion would expose decades of lies that would tear apart everything I thought I knew about my family. When my parents announced they had quietly transferred my entire trust fund, worth $8 million, to my younger sister Victoria, I felt the ground crumble beneath my feet. But what happened next, when my uncle Carlos, who everyone believed was paralyzed and mentally incapacitated, suddenly stood up from his wheelchair with perfect clarity, changed everything I thought I understood about family loyalty and justice. Before I tell you what my uncle revealed that night, I want to know if you've ever experienced that moment when your entire world shifts and you realize nothing was as it seemed. This betrayal completely shattered my understanding of trust and family bonds, and I'm still processing how one evening transformed decades of carefully constructed lies into undeniable truth. If you've ever felt the sting of family betrayal, please hit that like button and stay with me to discover what my uncle did next that left my parents absolutely speechless. Trust me, karma delivered justice in the most unexpected way. To understand the magnitude of what unfolded that evening in our family's oak-paneled dining room, you need to understand the Rodriguez family dynamics. We weren't just wealthy, we were old California money, the kind that comes from generations of successful vineyard operations and real estate investments spanning back to the 1800s. My parents, Miguel and Carmen Rodriguez, ruled our family like a dynasty, constantly reminding us of our privileged position and the responsibilities that came with the Rodriguez name. Our family consisted of 5 members. My father Miguel, a shrewd businessman who had expanded our wine empire into luxury resorts. My mother Carmen, a former beauty queen who managed our family's public image with the precision of a military general. My brother Diego, 2 years younger than me, and the designated family rebel who preferred surfing to board meetings. My sister Victoria, the baby at 24 and undeniably the family favorite. And me, Elena, the eldest at 29. From my earliest memories, Victoria occupied a special place in our household hierarchy. While my childhood photos were relegated to dusty albums in the attic, Victoria's professional portraits lined the main hallway of our Napa Valley estate. Her quinceañera was a lavish affair with mariachi bands and celebrity guests, while my own had been a modest celebration with school friends. The pattern of favoritism was consistent and unmistakable throughout our lives. Victoria has your father's entrepreneurial vision, my mother would say, despite Victoria showing more interest in Instagram influencing than actual business. Meanwhile, I was graduating summa cum laude from Stanford Business School and actively pursuing internships at Rodriguez Enterprises, the company my great-grandfather had built from a single vineyard into a hospitality empire worth over $200 million. My uncle Carlos was my sanctuary in this complicated family dynamic. While my parents attended Diego's beach volleyball tournaments out of obligation and Victoria's fashion shows with genuine enthusiasm, Uncle Carlos would sit front row at my business presentations and academic competitions. He recognized something in me that my parents seemed determined to ignore. "You remind me of your great-grandfather Luis," he told me once as we walked through the original vineyard that started our family fortune. "You understand that legacy isn't just about inheriting, it's about growing what came before into something greater." Uncle Carlos's story was both inspiring and tragic. He had been my father's younger brother and business partner until a devastating car accident 8 years ago left him paralyzed from the waist down and, according to doctors, with significant cognitive impairment. The vibrant man who had once been instrumental in expanding our business into luxury hospitality was now confined to a wheelchair, often appearing confused and unable to follow complex conversations. I worshipped my uncle, visiting him regularly in his specially equipped wing of our family estate. While my father focused on maintaining existing operations, Uncle Carlos had been the visionary who transformed Rodriguez Enterprises from a successful winery into a luxury lifestyle brand. He taught me that wealth wasn't just about accumulation but about creating experiences and value where none existed before. My parents' dismissal of my business ambitions became more pronounced after I graduated from Stanford. Despite my qualifications and internship experience, my father assigned me to manage our smallest vineyard operation rather than the resort development position I had hoped for. Vineyard management will teach you the fundamentals, he said patronizingly. Resort development requires instincts that can't be learned in business school. The irony was crushing. Victoria, who had barely passed her communications classes at a state university, was immediately given a director position overseeing marketing for our luxury resorts upon her graduation. The favoritism couldn't have been more obvious. When I met James in my late 20s, he provided the outside perspective our family bubble had never allowed. A dedicated environmental lawyer with a passion for sustainable agriculture, James saw through the Rodriguez family dynamics immediately. "They're positioning Victoria for something bigger," he observed after his third family dinner with us. "And they're deliberately keeping you in the background despite your obvious capabilities." I defended my parents initially, making excuses about how Victoria needed more guidance or how perhaps they saw potential in her that I couldn't recognize. But deep down, I knew James was right. The question was why. Why would my parents so obviously favor their youngest child when I had done everything right? When James proposed, my parents' reaction was disappointingly lukewarm. My mother organized a small engagement party at our local country club, nothing like the extravaganza I knew would have been planned if Victoria had announced an engagement to someone from their social circle. An environmental lawyer, my mother had whispered to my father when she thought I couldn't hear. She could have had her pick of the Ashford boy or the Wellington heir. James and I married anyway, purchasing a charming craftsman home in nearby Sonoma. I continued working for the family business, trying to prove my worth despite the glass ceiling my parents had installed above me. Meanwhile, Victoria flitted from department to department within the company, receiving praise for basic accomplishments while my genuine successes were treated as expected. Diego, for his part, wanted nothing to do with the family business. He pursued professional surfing with a dedication that both frustrated and relieved our parents, frustrated because it wasn't the path they had envisioned, but relieved because it meant he wasn't competing for control of the empire. That battle, it seemed, was solely between Victoria and me, though the playing field was far from level. Through it all, Uncle Carlos remained my champion. Despite his supposed cognitive limitations, he would ask surprisingly perceptive questions about our business operations during my visits. Sometimes I could have sworn his confusion was more performance than reality, but the doctors had been clear about his condition. Little did I know that a far more complex game was being played behind the scenes, one that would eventually expose the rotten foundation beneath our family's perfect facade. 3 years before everything unraveled, Uncle Carlos's condition appeared to deteriorate significantly. What had been occasional confusion and memory lapses became more frequent episodes of disorientation. He moved from his private cottage on the estate into the main house, where specialized medical equipment was installed and a full-time nurse was hired. Despite my demanding schedule managing the Sonoma Vineyard operation, I made time to visit Uncle Carlos at least 3 times a week. I would bring him updates about the business, knowing that discussing work had always energized him, even though my parents insisted such conversations were too stressful for his condition. The doctors say complex business discussions could accelerate his decline. My mother would remind me whenever she found me sharing quarterly reports with Uncle Carlos. "Just keep your visits social, Elena. He finds comfort in your presence, but don't burden him with work stress." Yet during those visits, I noticed moments of startling clarity. Uncle Carlos would ask specific questions about property valuations or guest satisfaction metrics before seeming to forget what we were discussing entirely. I mentioned these lucid moments to my father once, who dismissed them as typical for patients with traumatic brain injuries. As Uncle Carlos's health supposedly worsened, I began noticing significant changes in our family business operations. My father started restructuring departments, moving long-term employees to different positions and bringing in new executives from outside the company, something the Rodriguez family had rarely done historically. More concerning were the private meetings between my parents and Robert Kingsley, our family's attorney for over 20 years. For times I arrived at the estate to visit Uncle Carlos only to find Kingsley leaving my father's study with briefcases full of documents. When I asked my mother about these frequent visits, she vaguely mentioned estate planning and succession preparation. Around this time, Victoria suddenly developed an intense interest in the family business. After years of treating her director title as little more than an excuse for a company credit card and flexible schedule, she began attending every board meeting, taking detailed notes, and spending time with our financial officers. The transformation was jarring. "I've realized how important Uncle Carlos's legacy is," she told me over lunch one afternoon, her voice dripping with newfound sincerity. "Dad's been mentoring me privately. He says I have an intuitive understanding of hospitality that can't be taught." I tried discussing my concerns with Diego during one of his rare visits home from the professional surfing circuit. "Something feels off about all these changes," I said as we shared wine on the terrace of my home. "Dad's making major company restructuring decisions without proper consultation, Victoria's suddenly acting like the heir apparent, and they're limiting access to Uncle Carlos." Diego shrugged, swirling his wine glass thoughtfully. "You're overthinking this, Elena. Dad's always been controlling, and Victoria's just trying to impress them. As for Uncle Carlos, he's sick. It sucks, but it's not some conspiracy." But my suspicions continued growing, especially after I accidentally discovered documents in my father's office while searching for vineyard soil reports. The folder labeled Succession Planning, Confidential, was sitting open on his desk, and inside were draft documents transferring significant assets from my trust fund directly to Victoria, completely bypassing Diego and me. When my father found me looking at the papers, his face flushed with anger. "Those are private family matters, Elena," he snapped, snatching the folder from my hands. "Private family matters that apparently don't include me," I countered, my voice shakier than I intended. "Your uncle and I have made decisions based on what's best for the company's future," he said coldly. "Not everyone has the temperament for managing significant wealth." The conversation ended there, but the tension between us grew over the following months. I began documenting everything I observed: changes in company structure, unusual financial patterns, the timing of Kingsley's visits. James thought I was becoming obsessive, but something deep in my gut told me that what was happening wasn't right. The last Christmas before the trust fund revelation was particularly strained. We gathered at the estate as always, with Uncle Carlos brought down from his room for the traditional gift exchange. He seemed especially confused that evening, calling Diego by my name and asking Victoria when she had started wearing her hair differently. Yet when everyone else was occupied with dessert, I could have sworn I saw him watching my father with an expression that looked nothing like confusion. It looked like careful observation. As we were leaving that night, Victoria pulled me aside with unusual sisterly warmth. "You should really consider your future beyond Rodriguez Enterprises," she said, squeezing my arm. "You and James could do amazing things with your environmental law background. Haven't you ever wanted to try something completely different?" The warning couldn't have been clearer. They were planning to push me out, and they wanted me to go quietly. Little did they know that the revelation of my trust fund transfer would expose all their careful plans in ways none of us could have imagined. The day of the family meeting that would change everything dawned gray and overcast, typical for Napa Valley in late autumn. James squeezed my hand reassuringly as we drove through the wrought iron gates of Rodriguez Estate, neither of us speaking the fear aloud that today would officially mark my exclusion from both the family business and my inheritance. "Whatever happens," James said as we parked beside my father's Tesla, "we have each other, and we have a good life regardless of what your parents decide." The dining room of Rodriguez Estate had always been my favorite room in the house. Massive windows overlooking our original vineyard, a hand-carved table that had been in our family for generations, and walls lined with photos documenting 4 generations of Rodriguez success. Today, however, the room felt suffocating. My father stood at the head of the table looking authoritative in an expensive charcoal suit. My mother sat to his right, her dark hair perfectly styled, her expression appropriately serious. Victoria sat nearby, dressed in a black designer dress that seemed calculated to suggest gravitas despite her being the youngest person in the room. Uncle Carlos was there, which surprised me. He sat slumped in his wheelchair, a blanket across his lap despite the warmth from the fireplace. His once commanding presence had diminished so dramatically over the past 3 years that it made my heart ache. He barely seemed to register the significance of why we had gathered. Diego arrived last, looking uncomfortable in a suit that didn't quite fit his surfer's frame. He gave me a quick hug before taking a seat as far from our parents as the table arrangement allowed. Robert Kingsley cleared his throat and adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. Thank you all for gathering today. As you know, given recent changes in the family business structure and Carlos's health situation, Miguel and Carmen have decided to clarify certain financial arrangements now rather than waiting. Kingsley began reading through standard legal language, appointments of executors, tax considerations, charitable donations to causes our family had supported for generations. I listened carefully, waiting for the details that would impact my future. Regarding the trust funds established for each grandchild by Luis Rodriguez, Kingsley continued, Miguel and Carmen have made some significant adjustments to better reflect current family circumstances and business needs. My heart began beating faster. Those trust funds had been established by my great-grandfather and were supposed to remain untouchable until we reached 30 or inherited them upon our parents' deaths. Elena's trust fund, originally valued at $8 million, has been reassigned, Kingsley said, his voice becoming more formal. The assets have been transferred to Victoria Rodriguez Mitchell as part of a family restructuring designed to consolidate resources for maximum business impact. The room began spinning. $8 million, money that had been mine since birth, money I had planned to use for expanding our sustainable agriculture initiatives, had simply been given to my sister. That's not possible, I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. Those trust funds were established by great-grandfather Luis specifically for each grandchild. They can't just be transferred. My father stepped forward, his expression a practiced mixture of sympathy and firmness. Elena, your uncle, and I discussed this extensively before his condition worsened. The reality is that Victoria has demonstrated exceptional business instincts over the past 2 years. Furthermore, with you and James both having established careers and Diego pursuing his athletic goals, Victoria simply has greater need for capital investment at this stage of her life. Greater need? Diego repeated incredulously, finally engaging with the proceedings. She lives in a company-paid penthouse and has never worked anywhere outside the cushy job you handed her. Victoria's face flushed with anger. That's not fair. I've been working closely with Dad on major expansion projects. Just because I don't announce every accomplishment like Elena doesn't mean I haven't earned this opportunity. Earned. I couldn't help but laugh, though there was no humor in it. Victoria, you couldn't explain the difference between gross and net profit last year, and suddenly you've earned $8 million? My mother intervened with that warning tone I'd heard throughout childhood. Elena, this is exactly the kind of reaction that concerned your uncle. This competitiveness, this inability to be happy for your sister's success. Success? I stood up, blood pounding in my ears. What success? What has she actually accomplished besides being your favorite? Kingsley shuffled his papers, awkwardly. Perhaps we should take a brief recess. No, I interrupted, moving toward his briefcase. I want to see the transfer documents. Now. After a moment's hesitation and a nod from my father, Kingsley handed me the paperwork. There it was in black and white, my father's signature as trustee authorizing the complete transfer of my inheritance to Victoria. The date on the documents coincided with the period when Uncle Carlos's health had supposedly deteriorated significantly. This is wrong, I said quietly, scanning the legal language. Uncle Carlos would never have approved this. He understood fairness. He believed in merit-based decisions. People's priorities change when they're facing mortality, my father said smoothly. Carlos wanted to see the family business secured by someone with the right vision for growth. The injustice was overwhelming. Years of hard work dismissed, my dedication to the company treated as a hobby, assets I had been promised since childhood handed to my sister, who had shown genuine interest only recently. I felt tears threatening and fought them back. And that's when it happened. From his wheelchair in the corner, Uncle Carlos slowly pushed his blanket aside. With deliberate movements that showed none of his supposed physical limitations, he gripped the armrests of his wheelchair and rose to his feet. His nurse gasped and moved toward him, but he waved her away with a steady hand. That's enough, he said, his voice stronger and clearer than I had heard it in 3 years. The room fell into absolute silence. My father's face went white as paper. Uncle Carlos, you shouldn't be, my father began. Shouldn't be what, Miguel? Uncle Carlos interrupted, his voice gaining strength with each word. Shouldn't be walking? Shouldn't be thinking clearly? Or shouldn't be exposing the lies you've built this family on? He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small silver USB drive, holding it up like evidence in a courtroom. Everything is on here, Miguel. Every falsified document, every illegal transfer, every lie you've told about my condition. And Judge Martinez has a copy in her safe. My world collapsed and rebuilt itself simultaneously. My Uncle Carlos, had been testing us all along. And my parents had failed spectacularly. The dining room erupted into chaos. My mother began crying dramatically while my father attempted to approach Uncle Carlos, only to be stopped by a look so fierce it froze him mid-step. Victoria sat motionless, her perfectly applied makeup smearing as tears ran down her face. Diego moved to stand beside me, our shoulders touching in a gesture of solidarity we hadn't shared since childhood. Everyone sit down, Uncle Carlos commanded, and remarkably, everyone obeyed. Even my father, who had been ruling our family with an iron fist for years, sank into the nearest chair. Uncle Carlos moved with surprising agility to take his traditional seat at the head of the table. I'll start from the beginning, he said, his voice carrying the authority I remembered from before his supposed accident. 18 months ago, I began noticing irregularities in our quarterly financial reports. Properties that should have been generating substantial revenue were showing minimal returns. Development costs for new resort projects were inexplicably inflated. Money was moving through our accounts in patterns that made no sense for legitimate business operations. He looked directly at my father. At first, I thought you were simply making poor decisions, Miguel. But Judge Martinez, you remember my old friend Rebecca, suggested something more troubling might be happening. My father's face had progressed from pale to ashen. Judge Martinez had been Uncle Carlos's friend for over 40 years and was known for her expertise in financial crimes. Rebecca connected me with a forensic accountant and a private investigator. Uncle Carlos continued. What they uncovered was far worse than poor judgment. Miguel, you've been systematically embezzling from Rodriguez Enterprises for at least 6 years. Millions diverted into shell companies and offshore accounts under various false identities. My mother found her voice, though it shook. Carlos, you're confused. Miguel has grown the company's value significantly. The annual reports clearly show. The annual reports show what Miguel wanted them to show. Uncle Carlos cut her off. The real numbers tell a different story. We should be worth nearly 3 times what we show on paper. He turned to Kingsley, who looked profoundly uncomfortable. Robert, I'm disappointed in you. You had to have known something wasn't right about those trust transfer documents I supposedly authorized while incapacitated. Kingsley swallowed hard. Carlos, I was assured by Miguel that you were having lucid periods when major decisions were discussed. Given the medical reports that were fabricated by specialists who mysteriously received large research grants from anonymous donors, Uncle Carlos raised an eyebrow. Those medical reports became the foundation for Miguel's power of attorney, didn't they? My mind was racing, connecting dots that had been scattered for years. The restricted access to Uncle Carlos, the new doctors, the sudden changes in company structure, it had all been orchestrated. So, you've been pretending this whole time? I asked, still struggling to reconcile the sharp, strategic man before me with the confused, frail uncle I'd been visiting. Uncle Carlos's expression softened as he looked at me. Not entirely pretending, Elena. I am 73, and I do have some age-related challenges. But nothing like what they've led everyone to believe. He smiled slightly. I needed to see how far Miguel would go. Would he stop at financial manipulation, or would he try to steal from his own children's inheritance? He turned back to my father. So I created the perfect test. I allowed you to think you had complete control. I pretended my condition was worse than it was. And I waited to see what you would do with that power. My father finally spoke, his businessman's composure partially restored. Carlos, this is ridiculous. I've made some aggressive financial strategies, certainly, but nothing illegal. As for the trust funds, you and I discussed those changes. You agreed Victoria showed the most promise. Miguel, stop. Uncle Carlos's voice was quiet, but cut through the air like a blade. The game is over. My investigator has documented transfers totaling $34 million to accounts that ultimately trace back to you and Carmen. Not to the company, not to family trusts, to your personal control. He nodded toward the dining room entrance, where a distinguished woman in a business suit had quietly entered. This is Detective Sarah Chen from the Financial Crimes Unit. She's been building the case for over a year. Detective Chen nodded professionally. We have transaction records, communication logs, and testimony from 4 former employees who were pressured to falsify documents. The evidence is comprehensive. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. This had moved far beyond family drama into potential criminal territory. Victoria suddenly burst into tears, not the calculated, delicate tears she typically deployed when things didn't go her way, but ugly, gasping sobs. I didn't know, she cried, makeup streaming down her face. I mean, I knew something felt wrong with some of the papers Dad had me sign, but he said it was just tax optimization for the family. Uncle Carlos regarded her coolly. You knew enough, Victoria. Those documents you signed authorized the movement of assets out of family trusts. Your signature is on papers creating shell companies in offshore havens. She was just following my instructions. My father interjected sharply. Leave her out of this. Like you left Elena out? Uncle Carlos countered. The only person who actually demonstrated business ethics and genuine capability? The one you deliberately sidelined because she might have noticed your criminal activities. Hearing this validation from Uncle Carlos, confirmation that I hadn't imagined years of being overlooked and undermined, released something tight in my chest. James reached for my hand under the table. The trust transfer documents you heard today are completely fraudulent, Uncle Carlos continued. My actual intentions haven't changed from what I decided 5 years ago. Rodriguez Enterprises will be restructured with Elena as CEO and Diego as COO if he chooses to accept the position. He looked at Diego, who seemed stunned. You have more business sense than you realize, nephew. Your environmental awareness and understanding of younger demographics could help us transition to sustainable luxury tourism. Uncle Carlos turned back to my parents. Miguel and Carmen, you are removed from all leadership positions immediately. Detective Chen will be working with our attorneys to determine what criminal charges are appropriate. My father stared in stunned silence, his calculating mind visibly racing for an escape route. You can't do this, he finally said. I've run this company successfully for 15 years. These new arrangements won't stand up in court. The arrangements made under false pretenses about my mental capacity won't stand up. Uncle Carlos smiled grimly. Judge Martinez has already reviewed the evidence. The medical assessment I underwent last week, without your knowledge, confirms I'm fully competent to make these decisions. He paused, and his expression grew heavy with decades of contained pain. But there's one more truth you all need to know, and it may be the most difficult. Uncle Carlos took a deep breath. Miguel isn't my brother by blood. The silence that followed was deafening. My father sat frozen. My mother looked away, studying her hands as if they held the secrets of the universe. What are you talking about? Diego finally asked, his voice unusually quiet. Uncle Carlos's eyes held decades of pain. Your grandmother Isabella and my father Eduardo had been married for 5 years without children. They were going through fertility treatments when Isabella suddenly announced she was pregnant. Eduardo was overjoyed, never questioning the timing. He paused, his gaze distant with memory. It was only after Isabella died, when Miguel was 19, that I found her letters. She had had an affair with Eduardo's business partner, Antonio Vega. Miguel was the result. My father's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. I made the decision to keep this knowledge to myself, Uncle Carlos continued. Miguel had already lost his mother. I couldn't bear to tell him that Eduardo wasn't his biological father, especially since Eduardo had loved and raised him as his own. If you loved him so much, my mother interjected sharply, Why reveal this painful secret now? In front of everyone? Uncle Carlos's eyes hardened. Because Miguel has used preserving the Rodriguez legacy as justification for every manipulative, criminal action he's taken. He's wielded our family name like a weapon against his own children, favoring one over others based on who he could control more easily. He looked directly at my father. But the truth is, you've never understood what the Rodriguez legacy truly means because you've never had to build anything yourself. You inherited success and systematically destroyed it through greed and deception. My father finally spoke, his voice deadly calm. So, this is your revenge? Announcing that I'm illegitimate and destroying the company I've run for 15 years. This isn't revenge, Miguel, Uncle Carlos replied. It's accountability. And I'm not destroying the company. I'm saving it from the man who has been systematically stealing from it. The rest of that evening was a blur of legal discussions, phone calls to attorneys, and family members, leaving in various states of emotional devastation. My parents left together, my mother clutching my father's arm as if he were the only stable thing in her collapsing world. Victoria hesitated at the door, looking back at Uncle Carlos with something that might have been regret before following them. But Diego surprised everyone by staying. I want to understand what you're proposing, he told Uncle Carlos. And I want to know how Elena feels about working together. That night, as James and I drove home in stunned silence, I struggled to process everything that had changed. The uncle I thought I'd been losing to illness had been sharper than ever, orchestrating the exposure of crimes that could have destroyed our family business entirely. The parents I'd spent my life trying to please had been systematically stealing from the company and manipulating trusts meant for their children. Most shocking of all, I was being offered the leadership role I'd always wanted, but under circumstances I never could have imagined. Are you okay? James asked as we pulled into our driveway. I considered the question. Was I okay? My family was in ruins. My parents faced potential criminal charges, and I just learned that decades of favoritism and manipulation had been built on lies and theft. But I was also free. Free from trying to earn approval that was never going to come. Free from competing for recognition in a rigged game. Free to build something authentic from the remains of what had been broken. I think I'm going to be, I told him honestly. The following months brought both legal complexity and unexpected family healing. My parents hired expensive attorneys and initially fought the charges, but the evidence Uncle Carlos and Detective Chun had assembled was overwhelming. Eventually, they negotiated plea agreements that involved asset forfeiture, probation, and prohibition from involvement in Rodriguez enterprises. The most surprising transformation was Victoria's. When the full scope of our parents' manipulation became clear, including evidence that they had been deliberately fostering competition between us siblings to maintain control, she experienced what appeared to be a genuine crisis of conscience. I've been so stupid, she told me during a difficult conversation 6 months after the revelation. I thought they loved me more, but they were just using me differently than they used to. That conversation marked the beginning of a tentative reconciliation. Victoria entered therapy, moved out of the company-provided penthouse, and took a legitimate position in our hospitality operations where her social media skills and understanding of luxury experiences proved genuinely valuable. Diego surprised everyone, including himself, by accepting the COO position. Music will always be my passion, he told me, but maybe it's time to try building something lasting. The company restructuring took nearly a year, but we emerged stronger than before. We implemented transparent financial practices, brought in independent board members, and refocused on sustainable luxury tourism that honored both our family's legacy and environmental responsibility. Uncle Carlos, his health genuinely robust once the stress of maintaining his deception ended, moved into a smaller house on the estate property, but remained actively involved as chairman emeritus. His guidance proved invaluable as we navigated both the business transformation and the ongoing legal proceedings. James left his law firm to join our company as chief legal counsel, bringing his environmental expertise to help us become leaders in sustainable hospitality. Together, we developed eco-luxury resorts that proved both profitable and environmentally responsible. One year after Uncle Carlos stood up in that dining room and changed everything, we gathered again at Rodriguez Estate, not for legal proceedings or confrontations, but for a celebration. We had successfully launched our first fully sustainable resort. Our company's reputation had recovered from the scandal through transparency and ethical practices, and our family, though smaller, was healthier than it had been in years. As we sat around the same dining table where so many secrets had been revealed, Uncle Carlos raised his glass. "To building something authentic from broken foundations," he said. "To truth," I added, thinking of the courage it had taken him to expose decades of lies. "To second chances," Victoria said quietly, and I was surprised to find I meant it when I nodded in agreement. Diego, who had proven himself remarkably adept at hospitality operations, grinned. "To surf breaks between board meetings." Uncle Carlos laughed, a sound that had been missing from our family gatherings for far too long. "And to remembering that legacy isn't about what we inherit, but what we choose to build." As I looked around the table at my uncle, my brother, my sister, and my husband, I realized that sometimes the most devastating betrayals can clear the ground for something stronger to grow. The Rodriguez name still meant something, but now it stood for honesty, sustainability, and earned success rather than inherited privilege and hidden corruption. My parents had tried to steal my inheritance, but Uncle Carlos had given me something far more valuable: the truth, the opportunity to lead with integrity, and a family foundation built on authenticity rather than deception. Sometimes justice comes in the most unexpected forms, not as revenge, but as the chance to build something better from the ruins of what was broken. If you've ever felt the sting of family betrayal or the hope of redemption, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Truth, as my uncle taught me, is always worth fighting for, even when it destroys everything you thought you knew.